Hello from London. Welcome to the first ever taster session for LSE Summer School 2026. My name is Chloe Kwong, Senior Global Partnership and Student Recruitment Officer at LSE Summer School, and it's my pleasure to bring to you a glimpse of our wonderful program at LSE Summer School today. I'm kindly joined by Professor Neve Dunn, who will be the lead speaker for the taster session on competition law and big tech. We are also joined by members of the program and admissions team who are in the background answering any program questions you may have during the session via the Q&A function. If you hover over the screen, you will see the Q&A section, so please share any questions you have throughout the session in this area. We unfortunately will not be able to answer any questions related to the content of the taster lecture itself, but you are very much welcome to email us or Professor Dunn afterwards. Additionally, the webinar will be recorded and shared with each of you after the session. Today, we'll be spending most time listening to Professor Dunn, but before that, I would like to give you some information about LSE and the summer school. And towards the end, I will do a short recap and share with you how you can stay connected with us. Many of you may already be familiar with LSE. At its core, LSE is a London-based university with a global reputation for excellence in the social sciences. We currently rank 6th in the world for social sciences and management. The school was founded in 1895 with the aim of contributing to the betterment of society, and this year will mark 130 years for delivering world-class education to students from across the globe. LSE Summer School reflects an international outlook. It is one of the largest summer schools globally in terms of international cohort. Each year, we welcome over 8,000 students, representing more than 110 nationalities and 500 universities. The program runs from June to August and is divided into 3 separate 3-week sessions. Alongside your academic studies, you will have access to a well-designed social program and a professional skill program, both aimed at helping you to explore London and further develop your professional and personal capabilities. All summer school courses are modeled on standard undergraduate modules and are taught in access to the same rigorous academic standards. Today, you will hear from Professor Neve Dunn, one of our teaching faculty who will be speaking for the next 30 to 40 minutes. Professor Dunn specializes in competition law and EU law. She joined LSE in September 2015. Prior to this, she was a lecturer at King's College London and a fellow in law at Fitzwilliam College, Cambridge. Her professional experience includes work in competition enforcement with the Competition Authority of Ireland, as well as consultancy in competition policy. She has a law degree from the University of Cambridge, NYU School of Law, and King's College London, and she's qualified as a solicitor in Ireland and in England and Wales, and as an attorney in New York State. This summer, Professor Dunn will teach LL200 Competition Law and Policy during Session 3. Law at LSE Summer School is designed to be accessible to students with little or with no prior experience, while still offering depth for those with existing knowledge. So whether you are already enrolled in LSE Summer School or still exploring whether law is the right fit for you, the next 30 minutes will provide a useful introduction and an opportunity to engage with the subject. I'm now handing over the session to Professor Dunn.
So, thank you very much, Chloe. Good afternoon, everyone. Or I should say good afternoon from London, because I know that many people will be joining from other time zones. So I have been tasked with giving you a taste of what it would be like to take a summer school course, particularly in law, here at LSE. As Chloe mentioned, I teach specifically on the LL200 Competition Law and Policy course. And so the subject of this taster session reflects that, and we're going to look at competition law and the challenge of regulating big tech. I have chosen that subject because I suspect that most people joining the call don't have any particular interest in competition law as such. And this, in addition to being a really big topic within competition law and policy, is one which I think actually has interested policymakers and just the general public for at least the last decade or so. This sort of big question of Is it a problem that big tech companies have so much economic market power, indeed social power, within digital markets and in society today? And if so, how should we go about regulating that power? What would be the best way to actually try and address or to challenge it? So that's what we're going to be talking about for the next 35 minutes or so. Let me just add two sort of caveats before I start, which is to kind of point out that although this is a taster session in the sense that we're covering a topic that in fact we would look at in LL 200, it's quite a different experience in many ways from what it's like to actually study at LSE on the summer school program. And I think those distinctions matter because they're part of what makes the summer school program so great. So the first is that by necessity, we're all doing this online, whereas the actual summer school program is very much an in-person immersive teaching experience. So it's taught in the heart of London, in our LSE campus. You are taught in the lecture halls and teaching rooms that we hold our full-time programs in. You're taught by academic staff who teach on the full-time programs. And throughout the summer school sessions, there are constant opportunities to interact with faculty, to interact with other students, to kind of discuss the topic of the course and beyond. And so you're not really going to be able to get that experience here today. If you do have questions about the subject matter of the lecture, I'm very happy to pick those up by email. So you can see my email address on this slide. Feel free to send me an email and I'll try to point you toward an answer or some interesting readings or so forth. The other big distinction is that I'm covering this topic, which is a very complex subject, in about just over half an hour. So we're really only going to skim the surface of the relevant issues here. That also contrasts with what actually happens on the summer school program, because although it's only 3 weeks long, each session covers a huge amount of ground. I think you get something like 54 hours of class time teaching, in-person teaching over the course of those 3 weeks. So it's a really deep dive into the topics that you are studying. You get a really in-depth knowledge, understanding of the particular topics that you will be looking at. We look at competition on big tech for several hours on the actual summer school program. And so if you are looking for a very comprehensive overview of a topic, the summer school program is great for that. Now, we don't actually demand that you throw yourself into the summer school teaching with all of your attention. If that's not what you're looking for. I know that every year my summer school students find plenty of time to do sightseeing, to get to know London, to get to meet interesting people and spend time with them socializing in addition to their studies. But if you're looking for a very intensive program, if you want to spend your time doing lots of further reading and then do an exam and do very well at the end of it, the summer school program very much kind of equips you to do that. So competition law and big tech. Let's turn to the topic of today's presentation. What do I mean by big tech? Well, hopefully a lot of the names on this slide are very familiar to you. I mean, of course, the global technology companies that are some of the most valuable companies on earth today. They have this pervasive influence in almost every country that the controlling digital markets, but going beyond that and having a huge influence in terms of economic life, in terms of social life more generally in most countries today. So we're talking about sort of brand name companies like Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, Apple. And in fact, all five of those companies, which are sometimes referred to as GAFAM, have been the subject of competition investigations in the EU, in the US, and in many jurisdictions over the past 5 years or so. We're also talking about companies like Nvidia and Broadcom, which are very big, perhaps slightly less well-known companies that would be involved in the kind of infrastructure of the digital economy through producing things like semiconductors. And more peripherally, we're looking at companies like, say, Netflix or ByteDance or Tesla, which are not yet really on the radar of competition authorities, but are likely to face some competition law scrutiny going forward in the next few years. So these really, really big, well-known companies. What is competition law? So how might we regulate, or why might we regulate the activities of big tech using competition law? So I'm just going to read from my bullet point on this slide, and then I'll explain what I mean here. Competition law is a set of legal rules that aims to ensure that firms compete effectively in the marketplace by controlling the acquisition and the misuse of market power to deliver benefits for consumers and society. And so the core idea behind competition law, the competition rules, is that having firms compete effectively in the marketplace is a socially good thing. It's good for markets, it's good for consumers, it's good for society more generally because it enhances the resources of society that are available to us. And effective competition is a way to control market power. So market power refers to circumstances where firms are essentially undisciplined by market forces. They are able to raise their prices or reduce their output. They don't face pressure to innovate. They are able to entrench their existing position within the marketplace by excluding competitors. And market power is sort of the villain of competition law. It is a state of affairs, a set of circumstances that we're really concerned about, because firms with market power are able to evade the discipline of the market, act in ways that are to the disadvantage of consumers, to the disadvantage of society more generally. And so the reason we have competition law is because we think that effectively competitive markets deliver the best outcomes overall. What are these beneficial outcomes? Well, the primary aim of competition law, and I think most competition scholars, practitioners would agree, that competition law aims primarily to increase efficiency within markets, to deliver various forms of efficiency benefits. And this is why competition law is known as being a kind of a field that has a lot of overlap with economics, because efficiency is a concept that is developed, that is used a lot in microeconomics. What might be some of these efficiency benefits? Well, lower prices for consumers, greater quality and choice for consumers, greater innovation for tomorrow's consumers, for the benefits of tomorrow's consumers. So better products, cheaper products coming online in markets at some point in the future. There's a bit of disagreement as to whether we should be focusing on lower prices for consumers or innovation, whether we can focus on all of these benefits together. But I think a really core recognizable benefit of competition law is that it delivers more efficient outcomes. And we know that competition law is good at doing that. There is, in parallel, a number of commentators who have argued for a long time, but the debates have been very vigorous more recently, that competition law should strive to additionally try to achieve other social benefits. So things like enhanced fairness within markets, and not just efficient markets, but also fair outcomes in markets, enhanced equality, enhanced democracy, sustainability, enhanced data privacy within markets. I don't think anybody would disagree that these are socially beneficial things. I mean, they are good values. We kind of would like to have those values within society. It's a slightly more contentious question as to how good competition law is at making a meaningful contribution to the achievement of these benefits. And I'll explain in a few moments how competition law works, but some of the limitations within competition law means that it's not very clear how you would use competition law, for example, to enhance democracy or to achieve a more sustainable future, or if you do seek those aims, whether you can do so without interfering with the kind of primary objective of securing more efficient markets and outcomes for consumers. And this is because competition law is not a field of law that allows you to kind of directly regulate outcomes, to go and say, well, this looks like the most efficient market structure, so firms should do this or refrain from doing that. Actually, competition law comprises a kind of series of three pillars, which are really three discrete prohibitions on things that competition law says firms cannot do. So competition law says firms cannot enter into anti-competitive agreements with other firms, whether with their competitors or their customers. This is regulated by, say, Article 101 of the TFEU in Europe, Section 1 of the Sherman Act in the US. It also says that if a firm already holds significant levels of market power single-handedly, so it's already unconstrained by the competitive hand of the market, well, there are certain things it cannot do because that's going to be deemed to be an abuse of its dominant position. This is regulated by Article 102 of the TFEU in the EU, by Section 2 of the Sherman Act in the US. And most systems of competition law also incorporate rules regulating mergers. So if a firm proposes to engage in a merger transaction to acquire a competitor or another firm to merge to form a new entity, well, many competition authorities have the ability to scrutinize those transactions and to prohibit them if they think that the transaction, if it goes ahead, is likely to significantly impede effective competition within the marketplace. But it's not a general regulatory power, and that matters for what competition law can do. So why use competition law to regulate big tech? Why has the number one question that has been asked in competition law for the past 10 years or so been, how can competition law regulate big tech firms? Should it regulate big tech firms? What are the problems, the limitations of doing so? Well, I think there's both a kind of a push reason and a pull reason. There's a reason related to how good or appropriate competition law is for this task, and also a reason related to kind of the deficiencies of the rest of the regulatory landscape. Competition dynamics in big tech markets. We often have something what we call winner takes all competition. This means that what we see very frequently in big tech markets are positions of very, very strong and often very durable, long-lasting market power. So the firms I mentioned just a few slides ago, firms like Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook. These are immensely powerful firms, huge positions of economic power, hugely high profits, huge ability to influence how competition works across large swathes of the digital economy. And this, of course, is precisely what competition law seeks to control and to a certain extent prevent a rising to begin with. But if it can't prevent market power rising, it seeks to make sure it's not going to be abused. And so in digital markets, very naturally, the kind of competition dynamics that arise mean that we are naturally somewhat skeptical, suspicious from a competition law perspective. Why do we see these sorts of dynamics arising with such frequency in digital markets? Well, here's where we get a little bit technical. And if I had a bit more time, I would be able to explain these concepts in more detail. But it's due to some of the kind of very frequent features we find, not in all digital markets, but in many digital markets. So things like extreme economies of scale, which basically means it tends to be much cheaper for it to have a single producer within the market servicing all customers than to have a number of different firms competing against each other. You just can charge lower prices as a result. And these dynamics in digital markets tend to be very, very extreme. We also have something called network effects. This means that a product becomes more valuable to consumers the more users there actually are of that product. These are very, very significant in many digital markets and mean that it's very hard for a new competitor to break into those markets. And data, as I'm sure almost everybody would know, data is a central component of digital markets. It's necessary to be able to develop digital products, to improve them, to be able to monetize digital products, having access to data. If you are already a player within the market, what we sometimes in competition will call an incumbent, an established competitor, you have access to that data, which your would-be potential new entrants, new competitors simply don't have. And so it again makes it much more difficult for new competitors to come in to compete away existing levels of market power. So because of the characteristics of digital markets, we're much more likely to have these very strong, very durable positions of market power, which gives us a rationale for regulating the behavior of big tech firms using competition law. Just to kind of give you an example, if you think of, say, Google and its general search engine, Google in most markets in Europe has had a market share of 80, above 90% for a decade and a half at this point in time. So if you've got a market share of 90%, you have a really strong position of market power in that relevant market. If you hold it for a decade and a half, that's a really durable, long-lasting position of market power. The other reason why antitrust law has been so popular or so prominent in this regard is that until quite recently, tech markets were chronically underregulated. You know, when the digital economy started to emerge several decades ago, these were entirely new products, entirely new business models, entirely new business dynamics. Regulation lagged seriously behind, partly because regulators were reluctant to intervene against new innovative products. They didn't want to over-regulate something they didn't understand, partly because of lobbying, partly because actually some digital economy business models were designed precisely to get around existing regulatory regimes, to take advantage of loopholes in existing regulatory regimes. Think of something like Airbnb or Uber, which is designed precisely to avoid, traditional regulation of hotels and taxi cabs. And so you can offer the product more cheaply because it's not regulated. Competition law is a residual form of market regulation. It kind of exists in the background as these kind of long-lasting prohibitions that apply regardless of the market type, but only get triggered when you have anti-competitive behavior. So competition law applies to all markets, but it's not going to be an issue unless you see anti-competitive agreements or you have anti-competitive mergers or a position of dominance emerging that then gets abused. But it is there in the background. And so it can be applied, it can kind of be invoked in big tech markets without any need to get legislators to agree to a regulatory solution, to enforce it, to enact it. And so it has been called upon to regulate big tech in the absence of sufficient other forms of effective regulation. Now, particularly in Europe, regulation has very much caught up. There has been a whole swathe of regulation at the EU level regulating digital markets from the Digital Markets Act, which I will talk about a little bit at the end of this session, the Digital Services Act, the AI Act, the Data Act, many more digital acts. And so regulation is catching up. But part of the explanation as to why a number of years ago there was such a focus on competition law was because it kind of filled in the gaps left by the absence of an effective regulatory framework. So I mentioned that there are three pillars of competition law, and all three have some degree of application in digital markets, but it's one of the three that's been most prominent and I'm going to focus on for most of this session. But let me just talk briefly about the application of the rules regulating agreements and mergers to digital markets. So provisions like Section 1 of the Sherman Act and Article 101 TFEU prevent firms from entering into anti-competitive agreements. The most classic thing is price-fixing cartels. Now, you don't really see any classic price-fixing cartels in digital markets at the moment, but there's an interesting debate in the academic literature about what would happen if we start to see price-setting algorithms that are used by retailers, online retailers in the digital space, and basically every online retailer use a price-setting algorithm to figure out what's the best price to charge. What might happen if those price-setting algorithms, they are learning algorithms, learn to collude? Would that be an anti-competitive price-fixing cartel that falls foul of competition law? Well, actually, there are a number of conceptual objections to that, not least the fact that if it's the algorithm, the kind of computer program that is colluding, it's kind of hard to trace that back to the digital businesses, but it's the businesses that are subject to competition law, not the algorithms. It isn't a problem that has arisen really in practice thus far, but it's one that's attracted a lot of academic attention. You see on the slide the policy report from the OECD on this. Merger control is another area which has been discussed a lot in the context of digital markets. The big digital giants are infamous for their enthusiasm for acquiring promising new startups and not quite eliminating them, but certainly incorporating them into their own business model, their own ecosystem. So the company continues to develop and produce its product, but there's no competition in the market because, of course, it's all going to strengthening the business of the already very, very strong big tech companies. For reasons that are somewhat too complicated really in this very short period of time to explain, competition law hasn't been very good at catching these transactions. And that's because basically the competition rules apply to firms that have a certain turnover. Most of the digital startups that are being acquired, even if a very high price is being paid for them, actually they don't have any turnover at all. And so these transactions are falling outside the scope of the merger control rules, even if they are being analyzed under the merger control rules, because we're looking at usually potential competitors, not real competitors. Again, it can be hard to show that the transaction is actually anti-competitive, and it's an acknowledged shortcoming of the existing merger control regime that it's not very good really at dealing with digital mergers. This is something that we look at in quite technical detail in LL 200, but just to kind of flag that it is a problematic area. Some mergers have nonetheless been looked at by competition authorities. A very prominent example was Google's acquisition of the digital health and fitness company Fitbit about 5 years ago. It was scrutinized by many competition authorities worldwide. It was permitted, but only when Google signed up to a number of remedies that were designed to try and deal with its the potential for anti-competitive behavior to follow from the merger. It's an interesting example, though, I think, because in addition to concerns that the merger might skew competition in digital markets, there were also very serious concerns associated with the fact that, Google has access to a lot of very sensitive user data. Fitbit has access to a lot of hugely sensitive health data of its users. And many digital privacy advocates said this merger shouldn't be allowed to go ahead, not just because it has competition concerns, but actually it raises really serious data privacy concerns. And we don't think data privacy regulation is adequate to deal with these problems. The European Commission, which had to address these concerns, acknowledged them, but said, we can't look at these under merger control law. Under merger control law, all we can look at is the competition concerns. So if they're data privacy concerns, they have to be dealt with under the relevant regulatory framework, which is data privacy law. And it points to some of the limitations of trying to use, I think, competition law, what we in the US is called antitrust law. It points to the concerns of using competition law to try and deal with what are maybe somewhat public policy concerns quite far from the pursuit of effective competition and efficiency as such. So those are the first two pillars. What I'm going to focus on, though, is the use of competition law to control the kind of unilateral behavior of the big tech firms. And for the reasons I've already discussed, the fact that we tend to have winner takes all competition in digital markets, which creates these very strong positions of economic power, of significant market power. Most of the prominent competition law cases that have been taken against digital firms have been related to dominance or monopoly. So Article 102 refers to abuse of dominance by firms. Section 2, the US provision of the Sherman Act, relates to or regulates the behavior of monopoly firms. And this has really been the focus of enforcement in most jurisdictions in relation to big tech. Even though different jurisdictions have different wording when it comes to these rules, really, if you're going to show that a big tech firm has abused its dominance or is engaged in anti-competitive monopolization, you need to show three elements. So these are cumulative elements in the sense that you need to show that all three of these things are satisfied in order to have an infringement of competition law. So first, you need to show that the firm holds a dominant position in a relevant market, that it actually has a position of very strong economic power, which allows it to kind of evade the discipline of the market, so that we have a rationale for using competition law to have a substitute regulation of its unilateral behavior. Secondly, we've got to show that the firm abuses that market position through usually exclusionary behavior, which seeks to exclude competitors, sometimes exploitative behavior that directly exploits consumers. And then thirdly, we need to think about whether the dominant firm might have a good defense available in the form of pro-competitive efficiencies, whether it can argue, well, yes, my behavior does restrict competition in some dimension of the market, but actually it generates loads of benefits for consumers, which outweigh any harm associated with the kind of prima facie abuse. And it's really important to emphasize that it is not illegal to be dominant under competition law. So Article 102, Section 2 does not outlaw holding a dominant position as such. It's only if you've actually abused that dominance. So if you can show both the first and the second requirement, that actually you have an infringement. And if you don't have dominance, whatever you do unilaterally is completely irrelevant from a competition law perspective. It is completely fine for a non-dominant firm to act as restrictively as it wants to try and distort competition to the greatest extent possible, provided it's doing so unilaterally. The rationale for that sort of gap in the coverage of the competition laws is that it's very unlikely that a firm, if it truly doesn't have market power, is going to succeed in distorting competition. It has the disciplining force of the market, which is likely to make sure that to ensure that there's not a problem. But you kind of see the non-exhaustive coverage of competition law here. It's not illegal to be dominant. It's not illegal to act anti-competitively unilaterally if you are not dominant. So let's go through those 3 steps in a bit more detail. So the first thing we need to do, if we're going to apply competition law to the unilateral behavior of Facebook or Google or Amazon, is to show that those firms hold a dominant position in a relevant market. So this requires 2 steps. We have to identify the relevant market, and this is quite a technical economics focused exercise. The relevant market being essentially kind of the competitive plane in which the firm competes with other firms, in which the anti-competitive behavior is taking place. And then having identified the relevant market, we consider the market position of the defendant to ask whether it actually has a position of significant economic power. So we would look at the market share of the defendant, the market share of its competitors. We'd look at how easy it would be for potential new competitors to come into the market. Are there what we call barriers to entry into that market, or is it actually straightforward for new competitors to come in? And we'd look at any countervailing buyer power. So can actually customers of the would-be dominant firm, can they exert power that would control the activities, constrain the activities of the defendant? In many digital cases, this is pretty straightforward. You think of a company like Google, which has a 90% market share in general online search and has held that 90% share for more than a decade. It's pretty straightforward to show dominance in those sorts of cases. But it's not always, it's not the case that in every digital market that it's so straightforward to apply at least the kind of established principles. So for example, defining the relevant market can be complicated in many digital cases by the nature of ecosystem competition. So the relevant market concept is a very sort of 20th century concept developed by neoclassical economists, by industrial organization economics, which doesn't always work very well when you apply it to digital markets, where the boundaries between digital markets actually can be much more blurred, where what we are concerned about sometimes is not competition within a single segment of the market, but actually competition more broadly. And we have big firms that have multiple different complementary product markets, which all taken together contribute to these very strong positions of economic power. It's also complicated by the fact that many digital markets are multi-sided markets. General search, again, is a good example of this. So Google, when it offers its general search services, has 2 groups of customers. It has the users who want answers to search queries, but it also has advertisers who are seeking eyeballs from individuals. And when it organizes its platform, it has to bear in mind those 2 different customer groups. Defining markets in those circumstances is more complex, not impossible, but it's more complex. And just to give you kind of an example of how this first hurdle can be an insurmountable one, a very prominent case of the Federal Trade Commission versus Meta, which was decided last year. So this is an investigation that one of the US federal antitrust authorities took against the owner of Facebook. It actually started during the first Trump administration, and it wasn't until last year that it actually came to court, because US antitrust cases can take a huge amount of time to finally reach trial. An allegation of various exclusionary behaviors by Meta. But the case was eventually effectively kind of thrown out because the judge at first instance ruled that the FTC hadn't even proven that Meta had monopoly power, because based on the market definition at hand, Meta only had a 52% share of the market, the kind of personal social network services market. And the judge says you can't be dominant with 52% of the market. You possibly could be dominant under EU law, but you certainly couldn't be dominant under Section 2 of the Sherman Act. And so despite the fact that Meta is one of the largest companies on earth, and despite the fact that there was very clear evidence that they were acting with anti-competitive intent in terms of what they were doing, because they weren't dominant given the market definition, then the case couldn't proceed. If we do establish a dominant position, then we need to think about what sort of behavior by that firm might actually be considered to be problematic. We need to establish what we call in competition law a theory of harm. We need to show that they have somehow abused or misused that market power. There are 3 main ways in which you might do this in digital cases. So the first is you might be able to show that the behavior fits into a well-established exclusionary theory of harm, that the behavior, despite the fact that it's occurring in a high-tech digital market, it has parallels to behaviors that are well established in competition jurisprudence, more analog competition cases, as having anti-competitive potential or anti-competitive effect. You get an example of this in the Google Android case. So this related to Google's open source app operating system, Android, which it makes freely available to handset manufacturers, to tablet manufacturers who are developing smartphone products. But if you want to include Google's proprietary apps in your smartphone, your handset, and basically all manufacturers do want to include those proprietary apps, that's the Play Store, the search app, the Chrome app, you have to sign up to a very restrictive set of licensing agreements with Google. And the core concern in this case was that if manufacturers wanted to include the Play Store app, and that was considered to be a kind of must-have, must-install app, they also had to agree to install the search app and the Chrome app. And of course, Google wanted to get search and Chrome on phones so that users would use its Google search services that it makes a huge amount of money from. This was construed as a form of anti-competitive tying because Google was dominant in the Play Store app sector. It was kind of tying its other non-dominant products to this dominant product. It's a very digital technological market, but this is a theory of harm that's been established in EU competition law since the 70s, since the 80s, established in a case called Hilti, which involved the tying of nail guns used in the construction industry with the nails that you would use with those gun products. So it's a very kind of analog old school market, but tying is established as a potential abuse of dominance and then is translated 4 decades later into the subject of the Google Android case. In Android, there was also an attempt to extend exclusive dealing to certain practices of Google. That didn't work so well because of the specifics of digital markets. So you might be able to fit the behavior into an established theory of harm. It might not work so well. Alternatively, you might say that kind of given the new nature of the business practices of the products concerned, it might be necessary to establish, to identify a new theory of harm. And this is precisely what happened in the Google Shopping case. This involved Google's very dominant general online search service and comparison shopping services. So comparison shopping services are services provided by sort of online entities that allow you to search for a particular product across the internet. So you want to buy a particular pair of trainers, you can go to a comparison shopping service and they'll find you the best deal from, dozens of retailers across the internet. Now, Google's general shopping services, general search services are very good. It's always been less effective in developing a very successful, a very useful comparison shopping tool. And because it couldn't do so through technological means, it decided it was going to basically give its somewhat subpar comparison shopping product a leg up. It was going to give it a competitive advantage by pushing it up the results in its general search service and by pushing down or demoting in the results in its general search service competing products. So giving its own product an advantage and demoting disadvantaging, kind of deliberately discriminating against competitors. And to do so, it had to depart from the normal way in which it runs its general search engine. And this was held to be a form of abuse of dominance in Google Shopping by the European Commission in 2017. In Google Shopping, the Commission says, the elements of the theory of harm are dominance and this deliberate behavior to favor Google's own product compared with its competitors. It's a somewhat controversial theory of harm because all integrated firms naturally prefer their own business units, their own activities. Of course, firms are out to make money for their shareholders at the end of the day. The Court of Justice endorsed it to the extent that it was restricted to basically kind of Google's deliberate efforts to favor its own product, to disadvantage competing products, and the fact that that was very much at odds with how it ordinarily ran its search engine. So it might be possible, it might be necessary to develop a new theory of harm to catch harmful behavior, exclusionary behavior in digital markets. A third question we might ask is whether we extend the concept of abuse to exploitative behavior. So the theories of harm I've talked about so far are basically about excluding competitors from the market. And most competition law kind of focuses on that. We tend to, somewhat counterintuitively, competition law tends to be somewhat permissive of behavior by dominant firms that directly exploits customers, say charging high prices, partly because we think it's sort of a legitimate reward for effective competition, partly because competition authorities don't want to be price regulators and they're worried about incentives within the market. But we don't see that reluctance. We don't see that reluctance to kind of tackle behavior that directly harms consumers when it comes to digital markets. Certainly, some of the more recent theories of harm have been much more receptive of the idea that we should directly intervene against behavior that is directly harmful to consumers. A couple of examples would be meta platforms, where the German competition authority said that meta platforms had abused its market power by basically taking too much data from users. They said that the terms and conditions that users of the Facebook platform faced were unfair because they involved a data privacy violation. They required consumers to give up too much data without true consent. And that was not just a data privacy violation, but because Meta was dominant, it was also an abuse of dominance. It was also a competition law violation. Again, a somewhat contentious theory of harm, but one which has been endorsed by the EU courts subsequently. An Apple App Store deals with what's known as the Apple tax, which is the 30% commission that Apple charges to app developers who use the App Store. That has been the subject of an infringement decision and very high fines by the European Commission in 2024. But the Apple focused primarily on the harm to consumers that consumers faced as a result of both the high prices, but also Apple's efforts to make sure that all developers paid those very high prices. And they construe it in terms of consumer frustration and higher prices to consumers. So very much an exploitative abuse. So kind of, oh yes, so the third thing we need to consider is the possibility of countervailing efficiency. So if you've got dominance and you've got behavior that can be construed as an abuse, we then need to think about, well, are there any potential defenses available to the dominant firm? And in particular, does the behavior generate benefits for consumers that might outweigh the harm associated with either the exclusionary or the exploitative behavior? And this was an argument in both the Google Shopping and the Google Android cases, because Google said, well, yes, what we are doing is intended to kind of preserve our profits in the comparison shopping markets, to preserve our profits in the Google search engine markets with the Android case. But they said the reason we're doing this is to have money to invest in developing amazing free services that we provide to customers. Our general shopping service, very useful. We provide it for free. We fund it through advertising revenues. The Android operating system, we provide it to developers for free. And so developers don't have to pass on any costs to consumers. So handsets are cheaper. And so they argue that these should be taken into account as countervailing efficiencies. Now, the Commission didn't agree in the infringement decisions, and that has essentially been endorsed by the Court of Justice. But it is quite a big competition policy question. To what extent should we allow these kind of trade-offs if we say, well, you can restrict competition in one dimension because it's going to benefit consumers in another area? And it also links to the question to which we should be question of whether we should be prioritizing in these cases low prices today or greater innovation in future. And there's a really complex question to be unpicked about the role that competition enforcement might play in enhancing, in fostering innovation going forward. I have the slide on the handout is the very famous inverted U-shaped graph that was developed by Philippe Aghion, which tells us that innovation takes place to the greatest extent in sort of moderately concentrated markets. So if you've got a very strong monopoly position, you're unlikely to innovate just because you've got no incentive to do so. But if you also face very strong competition, you're unlikely to innovate because you don't have the resources to do so. So a kind of moderate degree of concentration in markets benefits innovation to the greatest extent. extent. It is an unanswered question how that really feeds into competition policy best. Part of the reason I put the graph on the slide is because, of course, Professor Agion is a professor here at LSE. He also won the Nobel Prize last year. So if you were to study at LSE, you are studying in an environment where faculty members are winning Nobel Prizes. I don't think he teaches a summer school course, but that is generally, it's part of the kind of LSE experiences of being amongst the Nobel Prize winners. So looking at all of that, so taking account of the various elements that we need to establish to show that a big tech firm is actually abusing its dominance and to use competition law to regulate that behavior. Experience of the past decade of kind of using competition law precisely in this way shows us that competition law can effectively be used to tackle abusive behavior by big tech firms. We have numerous successful cases in the EU and more recently, since 2004, a number of successful enforcement cases in the US. The US refrained from tackling big tech using competition law for a very long time, but now it is much more committed to doing so. But the problem is that competition law enforcement is not always well calibrated to address this. Some theories of harm don't work well. Some require a very big leap beyond the established rules. And competition cases often take a very, very long time. So, for example, between opening its investigation and the final judgment of the Court of Justice in Google Shopping, there was a 14-year gap. 14 years is too long a gap to kind of be requiring kind of effective regulation. So if that's how long it takes the case, competition law just isn't working well. And remedies can also be tricky, as many of the cases shown. It's one thing to say there's a competition law violation. It's another thing for the competition authority to say, and now you must do this to effectively remedy that. That's much more problematic. So many people have asked whether we might need a more overtly regulatory approach. And this is precisely what's been done in Europe with the Digital Markets Act, which came into effect in 2020. The Digital Markets Act aims to lay down rules to ensure contestability and fairness for markets in the digital sector in general, and for business users and end users of core platform services provided by gatekeepers in particular. And if you see those two regulatory aims, contestability overlaps very significantly with competition law, keeping markets open and contestable so that we can have effective competition. But fairness goes beyond that. And fairness kind of brings us into the realm of these additional values that we might wish to pursue in markets, which traditional competition law is not very good at doing. The Digital Markets Act actually looks quite like Article 102, the framework I've just discussed, in certain ways, but it applies very differently. So, like it's necessary to identify dominance to apply Article 102, it's necessary to identify a gatekeeper providing core platform services in order for the Digital Markets Act to apply. There are some qualitative criteria in the DMA, but actually mostly this is determined by quantitative criteria. So if you provide certain digital services and you have a certain level of revenue and market capitalization, and you have a certain number of end users and business users, and you've held that position for 3 years, you are deemed to be a gatekeeper. So that gets rid of all of the kind of fact-specific contextual assessment that is the necessary starting point for any antitrust case. So if you just can tick those boxes on a quantitative basis, well, then you're deemed to be a gatekeeper, and then you're subject to the requirements of the Digital Markets Act. The second thing I said under Article 102 we need to do is develop a theory of harm. There's no need to do that under the Digital Markets Act because all of the theories of harm are specified. There's a long, long list of things that digital firms must do and that they can't do if they are designated as gatekeepers. So it removes any ambiguity, any argument as to whether behavior should or should not be deemed to be harmful or anti-competitive. Many of these obligations actually have their roots in antitrust investigations. So the Android case, the shopping case, Meta platforms, Apple App Store. The theory of harm in each of those cases is in fact encapsulated in one of the requirements of the Digital Markets Act. But there's no need to think about that behavior in its market context. And most importantly, there's no efficiency defense. Firms can never argue that their behavior either doesn't harm competition and shouldn't be deemed to be abusive, nor that even if it does harm competition, it generates lots of countervailing efficiencies and so should be exempted on that basis. So it's much more difficult for firms to kind of escape regulation under the DMA. Once you're deemed to be a gatekeeper because you have a certain number of users and so forth, then you're subject to these obligations, and it's almost impossible to escape these obligations. There was some skepticism about how easy it would be for the Commission to apply the DMA in practice. It came into effect 3 years ago now, and it actually has proved to be quite a success story. The Commission is very effectively imposing and applying these obligations, in enforcing them against firms. And that contrasts very markedly with what's happening in the UK, which has a kind of digital regulatory regime, but it's much more closely mirrored on competition enforcement, and it's been really slow to get off the ground. The UK Competition Authority just seems to be really struggling to really formulate and apply the rules. So if we want very strong and very quick regulation, the DMA approach seems to be the one to go. But whether it's the better approach is a kind of a more open question. And this is my final slide, and this is the question I'm going to leave you with. Because if we go the competition law approach, well, competition law is a very flexible tool that aims to prevent firms from abusing their market power while creating and leaving space for efficient competition. So it's all about kind of trying to balance the trade-offs of intervention against non-intervention. It can adapt to the challenges of big tech markets to a large extent, as the successful cases of the past decade have shown, but it's not really a very nimble tool to regulate digital market problems. The cases take too long. Digital markets don't fit the kind of established models well in many dimensions. And often in digital markets, we're not really just concerned about efficiency. We're not just concerned about competition, but also about fair market outcomes as well. And it's much more difficult to kind of justify, to explain how we would incorporate that into a competition law analysis rather than just the efficiency focus. So if we choose to directly regulate with an instrument such as the DMA, that avoids these problems. We can have different parallel regulatory aims like the DMA, which is about competition, but also fairness. But it does risk over-regulation, potentially preventing, inhibiting efficient behavior, which will harm consumers ultimately. And so you're left with a kind of what is essentially a political rather than just a legal choice. Do you prefer to have really strong regulation, which might prevent efficient behavior and harm consumers in that manner, but is definitely going to achieve your regulatory goals? Or would you prefer a kind of more deferential, you might even say laissez-faire approach as reflected in competition law? Okay, thank you. I know I've given you a lot of information there. If you do have questions on the substance, feel free to send me an email.
Thank you, Professor Dunn, for bringing such a fruitful session with us today. I'm sure that a lot of us are inspired by this condensed session and has a lot to take away, including myself. Here, I just want to quickly recap some key information about how we structured our courses, in case if you're new to LSE Summer School or you're still deciding your course choices. We have courses spread across 7 different subject areas and across 3 different levels. Applications are currently open, but do remember we work on a first-come, first-served basis, so you might want to decide your course choices as soon as possible. There are also grade and English language requirements you need to attain when applying to us. Over here, you can also find a fees table for our program. If you're a full-time university student, you'll be able to enjoy the student rate. And by signing up for more than 1 sessions, you will also enjoy a bundle reduced price. Before we bring this session to a close, I want to say that summer school is not just an academic experience, but a holistic one. As mentioned earlier, you'll be part of a large and diverse student community with access to both our social program and professional skill program. As a sneak peek into our event offering this year, not only have we refreshed a new collection of theatre shows for you to join, we are also introducing new events such as a bike foot tour, talks that we collaborated with all the academic department here at LSE, and workshop that addresses how you can blend humanity with entrepreneurship. Essentially, summer school provides an excellent opportunity for you to meet like-minded individuals, expand your perspective across disciplines, and engage with a global network through both your course and the extracurricular activities. In case if you do have more questions surrounding the program, which we are not able to answer in this session, please don't hesitate to get in touch with our team by phone, live chat, or email. You are also highly encouraged to sign up for our mailing list or follow us on Instagram if you'd like to hear more stories about LSE Summer School. A recording of today's session will be made available and shared with all of you shortly, so do look out for your inbox in the next couple of days. Thank you again for everyone joining live, and we hope to see you in person in this or future summers.